Welcome to Capitals Uncovered with Martin Sieff and Pelle Neroth's geopolitics show, where we cover politics and geopolitics and investigative stories that the powers that be try to keep earthed, I should say, hidden from view. And so the reason why you're watching this is we're trying to give you a 24/7 honest, transparent look at what's actually going on in the world, free from narratives and spin and lies and propaganda. We don't have any paymasters, and we don't have any principles, as the word in English, which is all too seldom used. Principles, P-A-L-S, not principles. We do have principles, but we don't have principles, if you know what I mean. Well, with us today, I'm very, very glad to have Thomas Fazi, or Fazi, who's a translator and writer, a very well-known European, probably most well-known Italian journalist on the international Anglosphere scene, because he's written a lot of perceptive articles, been on a lot of podcasts. He's written a book about COVID, but you've written a lot of perceptive articles on the Unheard website, which is one of the better British-based magazines out there. And Thomas, you're very knowledgeable about European affairs, and that tends to be my focus as well. And what you talked about in your latest article was this problem that the European populists have, because I'll just explain. I was before 2024, the election, I sort of said, well, give Trump a go because he's going to break up the old system. And we're angry with our own elites, and he talks for free speech. He's anti-woke. He wants to restrict immigration. Well, immigration is out of control in Europe. You can be pro-immigrants. You just don't want too much immigration and all those things. And I thought, well, he's going to shake up the system, give him a go. And he gathered a coalition behind him of leftists and liberals and all the Joe Rogan young men, people upset with the current status quo in America, oligarchic control. And of course, he was going to end those wars. And it turns out he's done none of those things, perhaps except possibly immigration. And he's totally betrayed the MAGA people by going into this war. Now, Thomas, it's kind of exposed the populists in Europe, hasn't it? Because people are now beginning to realize, and me too belatedly, but I think you've been onto this case for a long time, is that even if Trump said everything he was, even though there were some aspects of Trump that Europeans could adapt, like free speech and truth about COVID, which he kind of trailed, the MAGA health movement, which Kennedy stood for, and exploding up the deep state. He was, after all, an American nationalist, and we can't go on borrowing him and cosplaying being little Americans because we're Europeans. And if he is an American nationalist, he's going to look after America's interests and not our Europe interests. And that's always been a paradox at the heart of the MAGA crowd. And you're kind of calling this out now. And you in your article in Unheard, which I advise you check out, put in the links, you are advising, well, what? A reckoning, a waking up, and where is that state of play going in the different European countries?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, Pelle. It's a real pleasure. Well, yes. I mean, I can see why many right populist or national conservative or sovereigntist parties, call them how you want, supported Trump. I mean, obviously they were aligned on some specific sort of cultural and ideological issues. You mentioned some of them: opposition to immigration, opposition to sort of the excesses of woke culture. Again, sort of a general opposition to the kind of globalist establishment. But at the same time, I've always been kind of skeptical of overemphasizing the sort of the importance of individual presidencies in the US. I mean, ultimately, if you take sort of a long historical look at especially at US foreign policies, so domestic policies may change from one administration to the next, but what history shows us is that in terms of foreign policy, there's an incredible degree of continuity from one administration to the next, regardless of the color of that administration. And I think it's quite telling that virtually every American president in their electoral campaign sort of promises less wars, less foreign entanglements, is generally pro-peace, and then they come to power, they come into the White House, and then they continue the US's policy of essentially permanent warfare and the maintenance of kind of an imperial global architecture. And so, I mean, so for this reason, I was wary of this, seeing these European nationalist parties sort of embrace Trump so uncritically, because it was quite clear to me that the overall trajectory of the U.S. The overall kind of imperial policy of the US was unlikely to change under Trump. Essentially
Mm,
because I think that the president doesn't have all the power that people think he has in the American context. I mean, there are several centers of power, many of which one
mm,
might almost describe as sort of permanent centers of power, what some people would call the permanent state, or
mm,
the deep state, which is the term very dear to the MAGA movement. But that's not just sort of the woke bureaucracy. I
mm,
mean, that's also, and first and foremost, the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon,
mm,
the corporate oligarchies that hold
mm,
huge sway over the political system
mm,
in America. And so, for all these reasons, I sort of predicted that America's policy vis-a-vis Europe was unlikely to change in any fundamental term, and that
mm,
the US, even under Trump, was likely to maintain that kind of master-servant
mm,
relationship that has always historically defined US European relations
mm,
since World War II. And what we've seen is that, in fact, this all seemed to be lost on virtually every sort of
mm,
right populist or nationalist
mm,
party in Europe, which, as I say, they almost all uncritically embraced Trump and
mm,
saw him as a key ally in their struggle against the sort of EU liberal globalist establishment. And of course, on some level, he one could see why they would see it this way, and to some extent, one might even argue that on issues like free speech and other issues, he has been and continues to be an ally. But when it comes to the fundamental sort of relations that define sort of the relationship between the U.S. and Europe, not much has changed. And I in this article, I say that this is really probably the biggest contradiction at the heart of the European anti-establishment right, and
mm,
that is the fact that virtually all these parties, when it comes to foreign policy, so on key issues like transatlantic relations, like U.S.-Europe relations, like NATO, and more broadly, like the U.S.'s addiction to war and its growing list of aggressions against sovereign countries, and even on other topics, like Israel, for example, and now the war in Iran. Many of these parties have views that are barely distinguishable from the mainstream parties that they claim to oppose. I mean, most of these parties are essentially pro-American, pro-Atlanticist, pro-NATO, and pro-Israel. And this means that ultimately they are okay with Europe's kind of structural subordination to Washington. Either they're okay with it or
mm,
they simply don't see it. Either way, it's a big problem the way I see it. I mean,
mm,
they were critical of the Biden administration, but they criticized that administration on ideological and cultural
mm,
grounds, not because they had fundamental disagreements on foreign policy or on the way in which the US has historically
mm,
viewed Europe. And that is as an extension of its global empire. I mean, a region that has to be controlled politically, economically, and militarily, and must be
mm.
kept firmly aligned to US interests.
But
And so again, they supported Trump on purely cultural and ideological grounds. But this, I think, was extremely short-sighted, and I think reveals really the lack of geopolitical vision of
mm,
most of these parties. And the paradox, I think, is apparent. I mean, how can these parties claim to stand
mm,
for national sovereignty, but how can you claim to stand for national sovereignty, for your country's rights against the globalist elites, while at the same time
yeah.
supporting the president of a country that essentially treats Europe as a province and fundamentally undermines Europe's core interests in so many
It
ways?
sounds like the Reform Party in the UK and the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, and they don't think about it. I think that I can speak for the Sweden Democrats, is that they came out of a not very sophisticated background and environment, and foreign policy was not their issue. So they just kind of parked it, or they bought it off a shelf. And then they were
Mm,
concerned with very much against Islam and immigration and reform. I think is very pro-American. But it's
Yeah.
I was in Brussels and working there, and I tried to think when I was trying to justify the EU to my Eurosceptic friends, of which there were many, was that we have to hang together unless we're going to hang separately, as Johnson said. Hang meaning stick together, and hang meaning noose around your neck. So it's a play on words there. Um, we Europeans, to keep our different, we're not. I don't believe in the European superstate. I don't believe that we should all become a sort of brown Euro pudding or something. I believe that we should be Italians and Swedes or Brits or whatever. But we can only be that by uniting to keep our separateness. Um, and then our opponents. So it's a kind of Gaullist vision of Europe. But we so what? How do we do that? It's like cutting the Gordian knot. How do we unite? Because what you're proposing, I'm going to hit skip straight through. They've got the diagnosis wrong. And the nationalist parties don't take the obvious conclusion, because they are nationalist after all, that we need some kind of European collaboration that leaves out the United States. But we can't, on the philosophical level, we don't want to do that because they're opposed to the United States of Europe. They're opposed to those Europhile parties that really believe in a federal Europe. Like, I mean, Germany was federated in 1817, then everyone became German, where it was very regional before. France, ditto. The Frenchmen were created by the French Revolution. It strikes me in my travels around Europe is that Europeans are quite different, especially if you don't speak the same language. It's how. So where do we go from here? What is your proposed solution to how a 5 or 10 or 15 year strategy, and how could European nationalist parties collaborate? Because we've got two wars on our doorstep. We're forced to buy American gas, Qatari gas. And that's out of the equation. Russian gas is out of the equation. Where do we go from here?
Right. Well, yes, I think it's interesting how the EU's sort of core, almost foundational claim was that by pooling our the sovereignty of the various European nations together into one big supranational organization, this would make Europe stronger. That together we would be stronger. And on the face of it, it seems like a reasonable argument, right? But in fact, if we look at the historical record, the exact opposite has happened. I mean, in I would say that in almost every respect, Europe was stronger, sort of up until the late 80s. So if we sort of mark the beginning of the EU as we know it today with the Maastricht Treaty in 92, I think it's up until the 80s. I would say that Europe was stronger politically, geopolitically, economically. And this was before the EU, as we know it today, even existed. Today, so 30 years down the road since Maastricht, which was supposed to make us stronger economically and geopolitically, in fact, we see that the opposite has happened. We see that Europe is more, and also they, many of the advocates of the European Union specifically mentioned the US, specifically said that we need the EU so that we can defend ourselves from the US and we can create sort of a European counterbalance to US power. But in fact, 30 years down the road, we see that Europe today is more economically, politically, and militarily and geopolitically vassalized to the
Mm,
US than it's ever been since
that's
World
right.
War II.
Mm,
And I think that's not a coincidence. That's not a project that hasn't that has sort of gone off the rails. I think this is a direct consequence of the EU itself, because by essentially sort of eviscerating the sovereignty, the political sovereignty, i.e., the political freedom of individual nation states, and concentrated it into, where those policies were to some degree accountable to people through the democratic process.
mm,
By taking those powers away from the national level and transferring them to the supranational level, which
yeah.
is structurally, undemocratic, structurally unaccountable, and therefore prey to sort of vested interests, oligarchic interests, including American interests. In fact, what what we see is that Europe as a whole and the various European individual countries have in fact become much weaker and, as I was saying, more
Yeah.
vassalized
Yeah.
to the US than they've ever been before. And so I think, this
So
is
the
a key
Maastricht
issue.
Treaty and then the European Constitution. I mean, you'll remember. Do you remember when the biggest story in the world was talking about the European Constitution around 2005, 2006? Lucky were those days when that was the biggest problem in the world. But I mean, it was so much
Yeah,
talk, talk, talk. And the
yeah.
Maastricht Treaty. I mean, I wouldn't want to live through those 20 years again because starting with the Maastricht Treaty and the Eurosceptics, it
Mhm.
totally dominated the bandwidth of all European discussion. And it's all turned out into nothing in a way. As you said, we're weaker. So, I mean, the solution,
Absolutely.
in a way, I was saying,
Oh,
the paradox, how do we preserve our separateness and we have to
mhm.
unite at the same time against outside predators? Well, we kind of had something working. I remember the 1980s. I remember Margaret Thatcher standing up to Reagan. I remember Kohl standing up to Reagan and Mitterrand, and
Yeah,
of course even in 2003 the French and the Germans
yeah,
had some. And it's interesting because all the I can only speak for the Anglosphere, but the or let's say Scandinavia, because Scandinavia has always been very Anglophile, so take that into consideration. But at least in the 1980s and 1990s, Germany, France, and Italy had quite a lot of cultural heft in Scandinavia. Now nothing. You hear nothing
exactly.
about French politics or German. Nobody speaks German anymore. Italy, no, you don't hear anything about it in the news. So in a
Hmm.
relative manner, even though Sweden was relatively vassalized even before, even more so now, and I don't know. So I think we've all become even more Americanized, even though this process being. And as you said, our GDP was almost equal to the American GDP in 2008, and now it's like 60%. Um,
Yeah.
God bless them. The Americans have just launched the Artemis mission to the moon. That's fantastic. Why is that not headline news? Why are we talking about the bloody Iran war? It's a lovely, good news story, and congratulations to them. It's fantastic. But have you seen that meme where you see a rocket lifting off, and then next to it you'll have the European reattaching a bottle cap to the
Yeah. Yeah.
bottle. And in America, they have a rocket landing on its launching pad. That's what the Elon
Yeah.
Musk's drive. And we don't actually innovate or invent anything. I mean, we are the less than the sum of our parts. Brussels talks about innovation all the time, and everything it turns to rubbish. And our militaries are 60% larger than America's, but we don't have any.
Yeah.
So what is it? Yeah, so it's we're in a terrible situation. It's easy to diagnose, but it's hard to say. But you're pointing to something that we might be, which is to abolish the EU from a Europe, to rescue the Europeans from themselves by abolishing the EU or weakening the EU. Is that your proposal?
Well, first of all, yes, it's about understanding that the entire narrative that bigger means stronger is completely false. You were just mentioning that every single European, or at least every single major European country before Maastricht, before the European Union, was stronger, even in geopolitical terms than it is today. And I think that points to a key factor that in ultimately in geopolitics, what matters isn't size, it's sovereignty. It's whether you're sovereign or you're not sovereign. That is the key distinction in sort of on the international plane. If you're sovereign, even if maybe you're relatively small economically, but you can still maneuver yourself. If you lose your sovereignty, if you're controlled by others who don't have the best interest of the people at heart, then you're bound to become weaker. You're bound to essentially simply be a spectator to what is happening around you, and this is what has happened in Europe. And so I think Europe is doubly sort of European nations are doubly subjugated by the European Union, but also in a broader sense by Washington. And also, I think what is lost on a lot of critics of the even on a lot of critics of the EU is how these two issues are tied together. The EU was never, I think, about creating a counterbalance to American power. In fact, I think that from America's perspective, it was seen as a tool through which Washington, sorry, could entrench its control over the continent, especially since the de facto fusion between the EU and NATO since the early 2000s. And so, yes, I think a key step is definitely getting rid of the EU. I mean, the EU has failed in by every possible metric. The only area in which it has succeeded, which was I would argue one of the key reasons why it was created in the first place is that it has essentially sort of, I would say, destroyed, hollowed out democracy in Europe and entrenched the powers of the European transatlantic oligarchy. And I think this was one of the key goals of behind the creation of the EU, and this has been
It was created by the
achieved. So we
CIA,
have to
wasn't
get
it?
rid of it. It was a project
Yeah.
that was, since the
Well,
early
yeah.
post-war years, was actively supported by the CIA and by the European, by the US sort of imperial establishment, clearly because they saw it as beneficial to their interests, as it has been. I mean, we simply have to look at the von der Leyen Commission, how she has essentially aligned with US policy and the US's strategic goals on every issue: foreign policy, defense,
I know.
trade.
Like Iran
And so you
attacks
can
the
see
West, sort of thing, you know.
exactly, absolutely.
Israel,
And
and she
so
doesn't talk to the nation states. I mean, she's the worst. I can't stand that woman and Kaya Kallas, terrible duo,
but it's
you know.
important to understand, that she, to a large degree, responds to that transatlantic establishment, which is
Yeah.
why she has done essentially everything that Washington requested of the
Mm,
of the EU. And so, getting rid of the EU is crucial. Ideally, sort of a coordinated dismantling of the
mm,
European Union would be the ideal way forward. But I think it's crucial for barring that solution, which doesn't seem very practical at the moment, it's crucial for any country that is serious about sovereignty,
mm,
about its sovereignty and autonomy, to leave the European Union. This was not. This is often painted as an end of days scenario. This is
mm,
not true. This is absolutely not true. I mean,
mm,
unions have dissolved in the past, and countries have broken away, without this being the end of the world. And so
mm,
that's a first step. You got to get away from under the boot of Brussels. But then that's only a first step. Then you have to acknowledge that then there's a broader sort of infrastructure of control, which has to do with Washington's influence over the continent. And so that
mm,
also means getting rid of, for example, the US military infrastructure in
mm,
Europe. I mean, there are
mm,
almost 100,000 US troops stationed in Europe,
mm,
over 40 major permanent bases, nearly
mm,
300 installations in total. I mean, this is a network of military occupation that has
mm,
existed since World War II. And
mm,
so, getting out of the EU is a necessary step, but it's not
mm,
sufficient. Then you
mm,
have to sort of address sort of the issue of US first and foremost military control, because that's one of the key ways in which the US, including via NATO, is able to control Europe. I mean,
mm,
these troops aren't here to defend Europe. They're
mm,
here to help the US project its power
mm,
across the globe. And this is far from defending Europe. I would say it's the key threat to Europe today.
mm,
We've seen the consequences of NATO's eastward expansion
mm,
towards Russia's border,
mm,
creating a devastating war in Ukraine, creating the conditions for that devastating war in Ukraine, which is still
mm,
raging on right on Europe's
mm,
doorstep. And today, these bases are still key to the US's military aggression against Iran and the
mm,
broader destabilization of the Middle East. I mean, the
mm,
US quite simply could not wage these wars without this network of military bases.
mm,
And again, people say, "Oh, how can you get rid of them? How can you get out of NATO?" I mean, France did it in the 60s. It
mm,
was a different political context, but I mean,
mm,
France
mm,
did it in France did it.
mm,
60 years ago.
mm,
So, I mean, I
mm,
think, it's also about real, sort of breaking out of the psychological
mm,
cage that we have, created, where we think that nothing is possible. Challenging the
mm,
EU is not possible. Challenging NATO is not possible. Getting rid of the US troops in Europe is not possible. And
mm,
I think, and it's, and on the contrary, I think that today, the conditions have never been that they've never been riper than today
mm,
for countries to do this, because
mm,
we see that the US is weaker than it's ever been. And of course,
mm,
this also means that it's becoming more dangerous. It's
mm,
lashing out
mm,
against everyone like a wounded animal, engaging on increasingly kind of unhinged for foreign policy,
mm,
even vis-a-vis allies. But at the same time, the multipolarity is an
mm,
opportunity for any country that wants to free itself from
mm,
America's grip.
mm.
I think there
Yeah, it's
are
all you're totally persuasive because I always thought, well, here in the UK, it's very difficult to sell anti-Americanism. The anti-Americanism comes from the pro-European parties like the Liberals, in as much as they're talking about Trump and vulgar Americans, and then the Reform parties are anti-EU, tend to be pro-American. And there's no one. I think it was a British politician back in the 19 Tony Benn. He was on the left, and
Yeah.
oh God, what was that? I've just forgotten the guy with the moustache. He was Enoch Powell on the right had that
Hmm.
kind of argument, which was both
Yeah.
anti-EU and anti-American. But you've helped me solve that conundrum because I thought, well, we need the EU even in some reformed form just to stick up against the rest of the world to preserve our differentness. And you're saying, well, actually, we don't. We don't just abolish it, and that's actually a very fresh kind of thinking for me because you come with an understanding of the situation and you're not just I think that what my opposition I knew the Eurosceptics in Brussels because they were a band of pirates who ran the private eye magazine and I was part of that and I thought they're never going to go anywhere and they bloody hell they did. They're now the biggest party in the UK. But anyway, I thought that they're so simplistic in their understanding of Europe because but you as a European, you have a much broader sophistication. So I like your argument. However, I am going to place before you that a standard argument that you hear in Britain, which is that Europe is squabbling for centuries. We're ripping each other apart. I mean, on the eve of World War One, we were winning all the Nobel prizes, and we had a genius. I mean, it was a continent of genius. America was a backwater. It didn't even have an army. It wasn't producing anything. And then we tore ourselves apart in two wars, and the Americans came and we had peace because presumably they're like an adult keeping the children from squabbling. If it wasn't for the Americans, we would all be killing each other. What do you say to that argument?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that after World War II, I think there was a widespread agreement among Europeans, among common Europeans, but even among European elites, that what had happened, this kind of utterly devastating European civil war, was a complete and utter tragedy. And so I think we probably would have been able to manage a more peaceful Europe, without the sort of the tutelage of the Americans, without the American bases. I don't think that's why we've had peace in Europe for all these years. I think it's simply because there was sort of a deep acknowledgement of just how tragic that war that war had been. That then again, I think two mistakes were made. I mean, I think the first mistake was to believe that precisely because, people. So there was also this idea that fundamentally it was the institution of the nation state itself that had created the conditions for World War II. And so the best way to get, to sort of prevent that from happening again would be to simply, get rid of nation states altogether and create something akin to what then became the European Union. I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nation state. It's kind of demonization of the nation state, which has also given us, many great things, including democracy, right? But there was this very sort of negative depiction of nation states, and in fact, um, even yeah, I think if we look at, even purely in terms of intra sort of European relations, the EU has done a lot of damage. I think today there's more mistrust and distrust between countries than there was before the EU. Especially we saw particularly during the Euro crisis. How we had these national framings. Germany imposing its policies against on the rest of Europe. The lazy Greeks and the lazy Italians stealing money from the Germans and the Northerners. I mean, this is so this rhetoric, which was largely fueled by a crisis that was in itself, I would say, largely a product
Mm,
of the euro itself, has done a lot of damage. And so I
mm,
think what. Uh, so I think a model of international cooperation and collaboration would also, I think, be
yeah.
sort of more efficient also in terms of sort of preserving relations between countries. And if we look around the world, that is the model that
Mm,
every other, that other regions are adopting. No one is
mm,
adopting the supranationalist EU model.
no.
We look at BRICS, we look at what's happening in Asia,
Mm,
Africa, Latin America. They're all adopting these kind of loose alliances, right? Where
yeah.
countries maintain their sovereignty, they maintain their cultural distinctiveness while collaborating on
Mm,
issues on international issues on which they have
mm,
common interests. So I
mm.
think that is
But
that is the way forward,
yeah,
and I think it's I think that's
I,
that's the
yeah,
historical trajectory. Yeah.
it's incredibly interesting. And would you? I mean, I think I mean the AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce in Brussels, is one of the most powerful lobby bodies there. And of course, the Americans want a one-stop shop that they can lobby rather than going through many different countries.
Absolutely.
I feel that Europe is becoming more Americanized than it ever was. I can't just say about Italy, but just generally, we don't produce
Absolutely.
our own films anymore, and we certainly don't listen to each other's films or
Yeah.
movies or whatever. I mean, Italian culture had a much high was held in much high regard in the UK, let's say, and Scandinavia, even though it wasn't that well known, but it was. But now there is none. It's just that the Eurovision Song Contest is a pathetic example of how we Europeans all we produce is these light-hearted novelty acts, trying to be more and more extreme each year, and we have this stupid. It's like a World Cup, but it's so vulgar, and that's what we've descended to in Europe.
Yeah.
The Europe of Leonardo da Vinci and Beethoven, has
Absolutely.
reduced to woke signaling and gay dancing, uh, and
Yeah.
but I like your idea also about but the idea that we increased tensions between us. It's like if you have a common bank account or something, everyone is mistrusting each other because there's no sense of control, and you can game theory that. So because unless there's uh, people say walls create hatred. No, walls don't create hatred. Walls create good neighbors, as they're saying, is because if there's a clear boundaries between what's yours and what's mine, then there's not that conflict. But there's a feeling that if there are no boundaries and you're giving away stuff and you don't have any control over it and you don't trust the other person and so on, and you can have this in psychological laboratories. You use students to game these things out, and yet we've had a generation of European politicians who said, if you have borders, well, next stop Auschwitz. It's always this.
Yeah.
It's always Auschwitz. It's always 19. We're basically, I mean, we've been living out the sort of legacy of 1945, the American legacy of 1945 for the last 80 years. It's like a James Bond series that never ends or something. It's like and it's going into repetition. We've seen, if you're over 40, you've seen it before, you've heard it all before, all these tropes. And at the same time, we're supposed to fight for Ukraine over a border squabble between two neighboring Slavic states who have known each other for hundreds of years, and yet we're not supposed to worry about our own countries being sort of the town where I'm in. It's like 40% Somali. Oh, no problem. But hell, send all your tax money to 5,000 miles away because the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians over. You speak the Ukrainian dialect or Russian dialect in their little village. So it's all a bit of a mess. But we're in a situation where I think that people are a bit passivized. I mean, they look for leadership, and there's no, I don't know, also we're older Europeans. We're all in our 40s and 50s average. I mean, a century ago the average European was 18 or 19, so there's much more oomph and energy, and now we're a bit too comfortable. So do you feel that there is in Italy at least, are there is there a movement? I mean, can you see that people are getting prepared to join along your lines of thought, or is there a while to go yet?
Well, I mean, I think this line of thinking is way less marginal than people may think. I mean, if you look at polls, I mean, polls show that there's still sort of a lot of mistrust, if not outright hostility towards the European Union. There's widespread opposition to Europe's participation in the sort of continuation of the war in Ukraine. So yeah, I think Europeans have a sort of a much better understanding of what's happening than people think. The problem is that it's become increasingly hard to translate those ideas into political change, because precisely as a result of this dismantling of the sort of institutions of national democracy. And so the real question is, how, is it even possible today to change things through the democratic process when you have when most of the when it's Brussels that controls most of the economy of European countries, and can easily blackmail these countries and engage in kind of financial and economic blackmail against any country that doesn't toe the line. And we've seen this happen in the past, and so I think so that's a real question. I think again, so long as we have the superstructure of the European Union, it's going to be almost impossible for any individual state to break away with the status quo, because we are seeing the Brussels elites interfere more and more directly in national elections to ensure that no country sort of breaks away with the status quo. We saw an entire election in Romania essentially be annulled just over a year ago, essentially because the people voted for the wrong candidate, and this was done on completely unproven grounds of Russian interference. And we're seeing that playbook now being applied to other countries. We're seeing that same playbook now being applied to the upcoming elections in Hungary, where again we're seeing this kind of Russiagate style narratives being spun in order to either get their candidate in power, or Plan B, delegitimize a future Orban government if he should win the elections again. And so what we see is that the this already anti-democratic authoritarian architecture of the European Union is getting increasingly anti-democratic, and increasingly sort of encroaching more in a more and more pervasive manner in the affairs of nation states. And so I think I think a lot of people are starting to realize this. And so there's this sort of
Thomas,
instinct.
we've only got a minute left, so I'm going to ask you. This conversation, I feel, is only halfway through, so we carry on some other time, perhaps after the Hungarian elections. As you said,
Sure.
he's ally of Orban, and he's might be on his way out. The Europeans are stopping, and they there was a fraudulent election which they cancelled next door in Romania on false allegations of Russian interference, and they're doing the same playbook. And again, they're talking as if they're the paragons of democracy, which they're not. But I'll just ask you with a final question. Our democracies don't quite work, and I'm sure you're a convinced Democrat. Would you advocate anti or non-democratic measures, protests or whatever? Have a very quick answer, because got less than a minute left.
Well, I mean, civil disobedience has had its role in history, but I think ultimately, if what one wants is systemic change, then protests aren't necessarily the way to get there. Protests are necessarily short-lived, and so I think we really have to think of sort of deep structural change.